Hello, in the first half of the video, I'm going to talk about how to care for Peperomia Polybotrya, also known as raindrop peperomia or coin leaf peperomia. And in the second half of this video, I'll show you how to propagate it so you can make a new plant. I'll also include my 3-month propagation progress. Let's get started with the light requirement. Like most plants, raindrop peperomia likes bright indirect light but can tolerate less light. Mine is in a southeast-facing window, but it's on the shelf to the side, so I'd actually say it's getting medium light. But it's still doing well. The raindrop peperomia is not a succulent, but it almost acts like one because it's got thick leaves that can retain lots of moisture. Because of this, it can tolerate different levels of humidity. I've never had to mist or use a humidifier for mine, and it seems to be doing just fine. For the same reason, Peperomia Polybotrya also doesn't need to be frequently watered. Like most plants, you want to let the soil dry out between watering. Another good way to check whether this plant needs water is to check the leaves. The leaves are normally rubbery and firm, but when this plant is thirsty, its leaves become noticeably softer, and that's when I water it. When it's time to water, I just pour in tap water from the top until the water runs out through the drainage holes at the bottom. I let the plant sit in the water for a few minutes to soak up any extra water it needs and then get rid of the extra water. In the spring and summer, I also add liquid houseplant fertilizer into the water that I use to water the plant with. You also want to use a well-draining soil mix, for example, a succulent mix or a soil mix with lots of perlite. I use about 50% houseplant potting mix, that's mostly peat moss, and then 50% perlite, and it has worked well so far. Raindrop peperomia has relatively weak roots, so it's best not to mess with them. I would only repot this plant if it has outgrown its current pot and become very root-bound. Given this plant is a slow grower, it's often recommended to be moved to a slightly bigger pot about every 2 to 3 years, depending on how fast it grows. Now let's talk about how to propagate Peperomia Polybotrya. There's several ways to do it, and I do it using leaf cutting. First, get a small pot with drainage holes. Prepare a well-draining soil mix like we talked about earlier in this video. I put some houseplant potting mix into the pot and then put in about equal amount of perlite. Then I mixed it and gave it some water. After that, let's get our leaf cutting from the mother plant. So cut a leaf off and then cut the leaf in half. Place the side where the fresh cut was made in soil. For the half of the cutting with the petioles, you can submerge the petioles in soil too. And please learn from my mistake and make sure that the opening of your pot is wide enough so that you don't end up having to squeeze the cutting in and damage the cutting in the process. I thought I could squeeze the leaf in by bending it slightly, but the leaf cutting was actually really stiff and sturdy, which is how it's supposed to be. But yeah, I ended up damaging both cuttings. So it's best that your pot is shallow and wide as opposed to mine, which is narrow and deep. After you've potted up the cuttings, you want to keep the soil moist, so somewhere between dry and soggy. This differs from how we take care of fully grown raindrop peperomia. For an older and more established plant like the mother plant, you want to let the soil dry out completely between watering, and then when you give it water, water it thoroughly. However, with the propagation, we want to help it survive by providing water, so it's better to give it a little bit of water but frequently. So it's kind of like the opposite of what you do with a fully grown plant. Aside from watering, you want to place the cuttings somewhere warm and with lots of light. Another thing that cuttings like is humidity. If you don't have a humidifier, a popular thing I've seen other people do is to put a plastic bag over the plant to create a mini greenhouse. I started doing this about 6 to 7 weeks into the propagation, but then about 10 days later I found the extra moisture in the plastic bag seemed to be causing the cutting to rot. I don't know exactly why that happened, but I did remove the plastic bag for good and cut off the part of the leaf that was rotting away. Luckily, as you will see in a few seconds, the cuttings still managed to survive and grow even without the plastic bag. It was around week 11 that I first noticed new baby leaves coming out of the soil. It was such a nice surprise. But perhaps if I didn't mutilate the cutting on day 1 by cramming it into this tiny pot and then later subject it to the plastic bag greenhouse experiment, perhaps it would have grown faster. Also, on this day, I decided to move the cutting into a slightly wider pot, which is really what I should have used on day 1. So as for how long it'll take for your cutting to root and grow really depends on your environment and what method you use. So let me know if you've ever tried propagating this plant. How did you propagate it? This is one of my favorite plants, so I'd love to know. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week. Bye!